Guys, Coach Kurt. So this is one that I've been meaning to do. I just keep forgetting to do it. This is something I hear all the time. There are no rules in the street. You can do whatever you need to do. It's not a sport. And I submit to you that life is rules. Even in combat, and I can tell you this as someone who was in the military, you always have rules of engagement. In the civilized world, even in a third world country, you have the penal code, the revised statute of whatever state or jurisdiction you live in. There are rules. If you think you can do whatever you need to do in a street fight, I mean, there is a measure of truth to that, and we will definitely get into that in some degree. But I hope you don't have a problem doing time in prison for involuntary manslaughter. And depending on how the jury swings, maybe even voluntary manslaughter, depending on how good the attorney is. Also, there's a strong chance of losing the civil case. So let's get into this. I hear this all the time from martial artists that are anti-sport, especially we don't spar because you can't do eye gouging and ripping ears off and chewing somebody's eyeball out of their head. I'm joking to that degree, but you get what I'm saying. You don't really have to practice those things. That is something that I believe. Like I've said in previous videos, Mike Tyson bit a guy's ear in a sanctioned sport fight, and I guarantee you he never actually trained that. He's just a natural badass warrior, and he just did it. But regardless of how you feel about Mike Tyson in that particular incident, you get my meaning, you get my drift. Now, I've, again, been a cop since 1997, and there is a slight difference between law enforcement rules of engagement. Some people call it a continuum of force, but that has fallen out of favor. Probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone did away with the continuum of force. Why? Because the continuum of force hamstrings you into levels, and a lot of officers thought they had to follow a particular color-coded scale. I can't do this until I do this. The United States Supreme Court came out with Graham v. Connor, I believe, in 1989, and that is the case law for the use of force, which is a Fourth Amendment issue. Search, seizure, security and papers, blah, blah, blah. Using force on somebody is the ultimate seizure of their rights and their freedom of movement. You beat their butt down and put them in the hospital, I guarantee you've seized them in that capacity. Regardless of how you feel about it, the Supreme Court considers it a Fourth Amendment issue. It's Graham v. Connor. Feel free to look it up. It talks about it has to be objectively reasonable. I might do another video. I'm sure I've done a video. I've got like 430 plus videos, and I've talked about Graham v. Connor multiple times, along with Scott v. Harris and Tennessee v. Gardner. These are all use of force cases that are the big federal ones from the Supreme Court. But even though you are Joe Citizen, you still have to be objectively reasonable in your use of force. It's just the way it has to be. For an example, stomping on somebody when they are down, and again, I hate picking on Kenpo, but by the very nature of the system, they strike, punch, grab, rip, tear, eye gouge like 9 times and stomp them on the ground and rip their beating heart out of their chest. And that's how Kenpo practices. Very choreographed, very laid out in how they respond to everything. Not a fan, but I respect all martial arts. All martial arts have something to offer. But I think, hopefully you get what I'm getting at. You have to be reasonable in how you use force. This is why I'm a big fan of the grappling arts. Now, different from law enforcement and Joe Citizen, even though you as Joe Citizen still have what I consider you're bound by reasonable force unless you want to go to prison. You have the obligation not to restrain or arrest somebody. Your job is to first flee if you can, and if you can't flee, then you have the God-given right to defend yourself. Even back to old common law, that has always been a thing. Even in third world countries, where the law isn't nearly as enforced as it is in this nation, and I mean United States, but you look at all civilized country, all the European countries, the UK, all these, every country I can think of has rules of engagement for civilians when it comes to self-defense. So I ask you to please reconsider the idea of saying, especially if you're an instructor, if you're teaching people self-defense, quote unquote, and calling martial arts in general self-defense, I get why that is done. We're talking about the physical movement of how to defend yourself, using force to defend yourself against force, fisticuff, physical combat. You get the idea. Either armed or unarmed. It doesn't matter if there's a weapon involved or if it's, you're not using weapons. So, what am I saying? If you're taking lessons from any martial arts academy, school, it doesn't matter, and your instructor is telling you about how to defend yourself, unless they are a lawyer or some kind of use of force expert, somebody from the law enforcement field, or, something of that nature, where they speak with some kind of authority on the law and how it is applied, not just on paper, but in reality, basically helping you court-proof yourself. And that's something I've talked about in other videos, is it's not just defending yourself there on the spot. That's your criminal law issues. Being able to use objectively reasonable force to defend yourself, not continuing to kick them when they're down and stomping on their skull like you see some extreme martial arts and combative systems and Krav do, that kind of stuff. You need to be objectively reasonable. If you aren't trying to escape or avoid the fight, you're wrong. If they're teaching you stuff like eye gouging and all that, that's fine if it's objectively reasonable. For example, as a law enforcement officer, somebody pins you up against a railing and tries to disarm you and take your gun. It's objectively reasonable to use deadly force or extreme bodily injury or maiming to defend yourself, i.e., they're trying to disarm you and you gouge their eyes out to defend your weapon. That is reasonable. It's yucky to think about. It's scary to think about. It's not civilized. But if trying to take your gun away and murder you with your own weapon, it is reasonable to gouge somebody's eyes out. Now, if you're a trained martial artist, you might have a less violent way of defending yourself, especially if you do Ju-Jutsu of some sort, Japanese Ju-Jutsu, Taiho Jutsu, Brazilian Ju-Jutsu, any of these grappling arts, Hapkido. You get the idea. I mean, I'm just running down a list of grappling systems, but you know what I'm getting at. Using a weapon to defend yourself against somebody who's bigger, stronger, more athletic than you. For example, my wife is 5'2", and somebody tries to accost her in a parking garage who's 6'2", 220, and they're carrying a bat. It's reasonable for her to pull a gun out of her purse and shoot somebody in the face. It's objectively reasonable. You get the idea. I'm not going to go down a big list of concepts and ideas and scenarios, but I submit to you that the idea that there are no rules to self-defense is BS, and your instructor is selling you a jail cell if they keep trying to push that scenario. I know that instructors say this, and they don't necessarily mean it, but they have to be more careful. You have to be more careful about how you teach people. If you are not a lawyer or some kind of law enforcement official of some capacity, even then, are you a use of force instructor? But the difference between use of force and control tactics are two different animals, and I'm certified in both. And I've done videos explaining that. If you need me to go over that again, bring it in the comments. I'll explain the difference between a use of force instructor and a control tactic instructor, and why many are both. But I've probably rambled on enough. I hope you get the idea, guys. Please, please, please use objectively reasonable force when you are defending yourself, and start with true self-defense, not being someplace you shouldn't be or don't need to be, being aware of your surroundings, blah, blah, blah. We all know that's part of self-defense, but as martial artists, we practice the physical concepts, the physical response, fighting, martial arts tactics and skills. You get the idea. All right, guys, Please take care of yourselves. Be careful out there. And please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.
Let's roll. Hey, let's be careful out.